Lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 5 verses 1 through 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Well, I don't know how many of you, have started a job in the last, I don't know how many years, and I don't know what the first day was like, like at your first real job. Because I started, my first job was a long time ago, and now we have this thing we didn't have then. They talk about onboarding. And it's funny, like I read these things online, and you have these charts of like this 90-day onboarding process. Ours was like 90 minutes. I met my boss. He gave us passwords to the computers. He gave us a task, and by 1 o'clock, we were expected to be working. I mean, one of the guys I was hired with, it was a pretty small company. There were like 4 of us hired at the same time, and one of them was fired in 90 days, for not having been productive enough. So I wasn't really used to this newer kind of elongated onboarding process that companies have. But, now it's a pretty big thing. And one of the more famous companies for doing this onboarding is Zappos, the shoe company that Amazon bought. And they were known for the fact that they would make every new hire, it didn't matter what their job was, computer programmers, whatever, they had to work in customer service as a part of their onboarding. So they would have to spend some time taking customer service calls because that was what the company wanted to get across. They had to put their focus in the right place. And this is a quote from the founder of Zappos, who tragically died a few years ago, but he died in a house fire a few years back. But his quote about the company was that Zappos is a customer service company that just happens to sell shoes. And so he wanted to get that ethos across to the employees by making every single employee, no matter what their job was going to be, spend some time handling customer service calls so that they would understand that the focus was the customer. Now, last week, our passage ended with a verse of the disciples going out. So last week was the call of the first disciples in Matthew, and it ended with them going out to serve the people. It said, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news, curing every disease and every sickness. And then there are just a couple more verses after that before we get to this week's passage. And then in verses 24, it says his fame spread throughout all Syria. They brought to him all the sick, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him. And so the crowds are following him and these newly called disciples from everywhere because of all of the healing that they're doing. And this was the lead up to where our passage begins today. So our passage begins today with the next verse, which is, when Jesus saw the crowds, he goes up the mountain, he gets away from the crowds, and then he sits down, and his disciples came to him. So the disciples start by being with him as he's healing and healing and healing and healing, and the crowds are hearing about it. They're learning that this is a source of healing. They are bringing themselves or their family members, their friends, whoever it is that needs healing. They're following Jesus. And so he goes up the mountain away from the crowds, and his disciples come to him for a private teaching. because what Jesus is doing is onboarding his disciples. So this is actually Jesus' onboarding process for his disciples. You've been healing, you've spent some time in customer service, and now I need to teach you about what we're doing. So he first led them to see the needs of the people that are out there, to see the humanity of the people that they were here to serve. But then he's explaining to them what they see, how to interpret what they see. Because the question is, what were they seeing when they saw the crowds that were coming for healing? And Jesus is reminding them to see people who are blessed. Now, one of the more varied things that's out there is how you interpret the Greek word that gets translated in this passage as blessed. The Greek word is this word makarios, which has a variety of meanings. And the word makarios can mean blessed, but it also means favored, it means fortunate, it can mean happy, and it can mean privileged. It's multiple meanings that are all favorable in different ways. One of the more interesting words that could be used is honored, that they are honored. But we have to unpack what this would mean in terms of the specific things that Jesus is talking about. So the first three things that Jesus says is, blessed, honored, favored, however you want to put it, are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, or the meek. Most scholars interpret these as being spiritual in nature rather than something that's literal in terms of like mourning. That, for instance, we talk about people being in grief, and you can be in grief over lots of things. It's not necessarily, nor would it necessarily be appropriate to have the word mourning here refer to like the death of a loved one, okay? Because that's just not something that's good. And it's certainly not something you would say to people. Remember, Jesus is speaking in the third person here, right? Blessed are the poor, blessed are those, all right, blessed are the meek. He's speaking in the third person because in the first person, this would actually be cruel. I mean, can you imagine? You don't go to someone at a wake and say, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I mean, come on. All right? This would be, negative EQ, all right, to say that. This is something that he is saying to the disciples in the third person about the people that they are serving. And most scholars believe that this is really referring to people understanding their own deficiencies, that they're poor in spirit, they're feeling separated from God, that they're in grief over their own deficiencies, over their own situation. And meek is this word that I really wish they hadn't used meek to translate this word praus from the Greek, which just means to not be self-impressed. Okay. It's not about being, little mousy and quiet. It's about being not so full of yourself. And so you take these together, and what Jesus is really doing is exalting humility. He's emphasizing that, it's too easy to be enamored of power. It's so easy to be enamored of this amazing ability that Jesus has to heal the sick and to be one of his disciples, to be a person who's been called to follow this person who has great power, could lead to this feeling of self-importance. And that's what Jesus is trying to make sure they do not have. That the point of the healing was to honor those who are in need. The point of the healing was to see those in need as being elevated, not being lower, which is something that people can have a tendency to do. It is so easy for helpers to somehow have the attitude that they are superior to the people they are helping. And this is one of the more dangerous attitudes that is out there, and something that we have to continually combat. That the people who are helping are not superior to those who are being helped, but rather the helper is seeing and honoring the dignity of the person who requires the help. I've always loved this quote from the late Henry Nouwen, that prolific author and priest who wrote such wonderful, wonderful books. But he said this, and it always stuck with me. It's always a reminder. He said, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, not blessed are those who care for the poor." And this is such a reminder because it inverts our usual sense of who is in the prior position, who's in the superior position. Because sometimes when you hear these Beatitudes, as they're known, when you hear these blessings, there's a tendency to only see the after part and to see the condition that people are in as just something to be overcome, as just something that you're going to get past. That if you are in lack, well, don't worry because more is coming. You're in a tough situation now, don't worry because something better is coming. And it's not about what comes after the situation. It's also having the ability to find the blessing in the situation. One of the harder things for people to do is to be in a tough space and still feel the blessing in the space. Not the blessing about being beyond it, but to sit there and find the blessing in the hardship itself, to find the blessing in the circumstance. How are we blessed in that circumstance, which is difficult? Because Jesus did not want the disciples feeling superior to the people they were serving. And this would have been so easy to do, especially because of the cultural phenomenon that we've talked about in church circles. You hear it all the time. The cultural phenomenon of the belief that illness was caused by a person's sin. So the belief that a person had got themselves into that predicament, and boy, you hear that today, right? You still hear people talking about, oh, well, it's their fault that they're in that circumstance. Somehow that they are to blame for being in their circumstance. And this was something that Jesus was trying to make sure his disciples did not have as an attitude. Jesus was inverting their view of the hierarchy of the helper versus the helped. The helper is not superior to the person who's being helped. And so at Zappos, those programmers who worked customer service were being taught that they weren't above that task, nor were they above the customers. But you can only imagine the extent to which, imagine the first time, remember that old saying, the customer is always right? Okay. Imagine what that's like to hear for the first time. If you've never heard it before, and someone says, well, in our store, the customer is always right. And they're like, what? I mean, I've certainly experienced it. I've been to different stores, and I've been to countries where this certainly wasn't a saying. I won't say which one, but I've been to them. And I remember going into a shop, and really the attitude that I could feel coming from the person behind the counter was, well, if you were any good, you'd be a shopkeeper like me. And that was kind of the attitude they were giving off. That was their vibe. And it varies from region to region. Actually, if you go back, by the way, go back into the 80s and read about Nordstrom. Right? The one at the Garden State Plaza was actually the first Nordstrom on the East Coast. All right, okay. In this area, and you go back to the 80s and they talk to them about expanding into the East, and there's actually a quote from an exec, if you Google it, where they were worried about whether people in this part of the country would be willing to accept Nordstrom's standards of customer service. They weren't really sure that you could get, these New Jersey people, to be as friendly and customer welcoming as Nordstrom expected. They did, by the way, I think. People around here are pretty good. They just don't show it sometimes, but they're pretty good. And then you get into this next one that Jesus talks about. And he says, look, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He's talking about that need to have a burning desire for righteousness. I mean, you think about this feeling. When I think about hunger and thirst, right, I think about, at least for me, I think about being hangry. Right? Hangry is something I get to, that's a place I get to a lot for physical reasons. But this is really the imagery that I get. It's not just about sort of saying that, okay, righteousness is something I would like. Of course we're in that place. Righteousness is something I would prefer. Of course we're in that place. The question is kind of whether you get to that hangry place about righteousness. Whether you get to that place that says that righteousness is something I have to have, and I have to have it now. I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to delay. I'm not going to defer. I'm not going to put it off. I need it, and I need it now. And remember here, what's interesting is that Jesus is still speaking in the third person. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And that's not just telling people that they should have the same hunger and thirst. It's also telling people how to regard those who do. Because quite often, you get into a circumstance where you see people who are acting out of a hunger and thirst for righteousness, and they are told that they need to simmer down. And they are told, you need to stop upsetting the apple cart. They are told, you need to honor the status quo. And instead of criticizing them, Jesus is reminding his disciples that there are those who are acting in ways that may seem a little socially unacceptable. But honor that. Honor that when it comes from a hunger and thirst for righteousness. Honor the fact that they're speaking up and speaking out in a way that demands righteousness that may not seem wise, it may not seem friendly, but it stems from this hunger that they have within them. They need to see the righteousness happen. They're so driven by the desire for the righteousness that, yes, they're willing to do some things that aren't that popular. Because we're called to action. See, hunger and thirst means you're driven to act. When you're in that circumstance, you have to become someone who can't not act. And that's really something that is honored, right? That's something that we are called to. We're called to be people who can't not act in the face of injustice in the world. And we need to support those who feel that way. Finally, there's another set where Jesus talks about the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. And this is internal stuff happening. Right? This is really, ultimately, being merciful, being pure in heart, being a peacemaker. This is ultimately character attributes. These are about who you are and what's going on inside of you. And so you put these things together, and these blessings, these core values, focus on humility, action, and character. And this is something that really is central to Jesus' onboarding process. That he's telling the disciples that this is what you need to be about. This is what we need to honor. We need to have people who are humble, who are driven to act, and do this stemming from a pure heart, good character within. And I wonder, what would your core values be? I mean, if you had an onboarding process for family members, If you had an onboarding process and said, "Hi, welcome to our family. This is day one of orientation. And we're going to talk to you about what we stand for. We're going to talk to you about what is central to us, what means the most to us." What would your orientation process be like? How would you sum up and communicate the core values in your life? Right? And how important are those things to you? How important is humility to you? How important is the drive to act for righteousness to you? How important are those character attributes of being merciful, of being pure in heart, of being a peacemaker? What would you write down as a statement of your core values in life? The things that are really central to you being you, to your family being your family. What are the core values by which you live? And how important are they to you? Because finally, Jesus turns from speaking about people in the third person and finally says you to the disciples. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you. See, now it's not about them anymore. Now it's about you and the price that you will pay. And the funny thing that's happening right now in our world is that we don't pay a price in this society for saying we're Christian, but we can pay a price for actually acting on it. We can pay a price in our society for actually living into standing up for our neighbors. Standing up for our neighbors even when it's against the authorities. Standing up for our neighbors, standing up for righteousness, all right? Saying you're Christian, it's not going to cost you anything in this world. Actually living up to those values and defending the people who are being persecuted, defending people who are being discriminated against, defending people who are the victims of injustice, standing up for a fairer, more just society, that can cost you in this world. It can cost you your life, because we've seen it. So you have to ask yourself, and Jesus is asking the disciples, okay, these were the values. Now, are you ready to hold to them even at an extreme cost? It's funny, Zappos is known for something called the offer. The offer is this. You go through your onboarding, and after you've been trained, usually after about 4 weeks, they offer you $4,000 to quit. You go through, and I heard it's even up to like $5,000. It's been going up over the years. So you go through the training, and they go, okay, here, you've gone through 4 weeks of training, and if you quit today, we will pay you for the amount of time worked, plus we will give you a $4,000 bonus. Because they don't want anyone who would take it. Apparently only 2 or 3% of the people take the offer. Because they don't want anyone who doesn't want to be a part of their culture, who doesn't want to work for them enough to reject the bonus. All right, you're all going to leave here and apply for jobs there, but okay. But think about that, right? Think about that idea. The idea that they only want the truly committed. And they're going to find out who's truly committed by offering a bonus to quit. It's fascinating. And it's kind of telling that a lot of companies talk about doing this. They don't copy it. They're afraid to copy it because they're afraid of how many people would take them up on the offer. So when Jesus tells his disciples, by the way, you're going to be persecuted, he's basically making them the offer without the pay. He's basically saying, hey, look, do you want out? Do you want out? Are you ready? Are you ready to do this? Or do you want out because of the cost? I wonder what would happen if churches were making some kind of similar offer. I mean, after all, what would you sacrifice to maintain your core values? What if somehow we paid you to never go to church again? Here's a lump sum of money, but this is the deal. You've got to renounce your faith. But here, if you renounce your faith, here's a check. If you renounce Jesus, here's a check. Because a lot of people actually do take the offer when it comes to violating their values. A lot of people actually will, in effect, take the offer. They'll sacrifice their values because it's worth it somehow to them. Because the core question that Jesus is posing to his disciples here is not just about their values and what they need to believe. He's also questioning them on what they're willing to endure in order to hold to those values. And that's something that we have to confront within ourselves. What are we willing to endure in order to hold to the values that we profess? Because that is what the world wants to see. See, we won't change the world by arguing for our values. We won't change the world by putting forth a list of wonderful values that everybody would just kind of nod their head and agree with. We change the world by adopting those values ourselves. We change the world by holding to those values even when it's hard. Because that's how the early church grew. The early church grew because they helped the poor even when they themselves landed in poverty. They were never too poor to be generous. The early church changed the world in a time when people did not understand how diseases spread. And sometimes I feel like we're forgetting. They didn't understand how diseases spread. They just knew that people who were in proximity to the sick often got sick. And so it wasn't uncommon for people to abandon those who were sick out of fear of catching it themselves. And who cared for them? The Christians. That's what the Christians became known for. In that ancient world, the Christians became known for the people who would even care for an abandoned stranger who was sick, even if that illness was almost certainly fatal. The Christians would still care for them because they saw the dignity of the human being that they were and wanted to honor that even if they were going to die, they were going to die loved. They were going to die cared for. They were not going to die alone and abandoned. And the Christians did it even as many of them got sick themselves and died. Because they were willing to pay that price in order to hold to their values. And that is what changed the world. That is what drew people to the faith. It was not the rhetoric. It was not the soundness of Jesus' teachings. It was not how charismatic he was as a speaker. It was how his followers adopted these values and lived them no matter the price they paid for doing so. And they did it without an attitude of superiority. but they did it with an attitude of humility. They did it stemming from a purity of heart about who they were and why they were helping. They did it honoring and understanding the dignity of those that they were working with. And they did it because they had this hunger and thirst to act. They acted because they couldn't not act. And it didn't matter what the offer would be for them to give up what they believed in. They did it at the cost of their possessions. They did it at the cost of their lives. Right? Because these were the values that they held that were worth everything to them. And if we go into the world and we live into the things that we profess, we live into standing up for those who are being beaten down, stand up for those who are being persecuted, stand up for those who are in need, stand beside the ones who are lonely and left out and left behind. It's in doing that, no matter the cost, that leads us to change the world around us. Let me pray for us. Almighty and gracious God, you wanted us to not just be helpers, but to be people who help with the right attitude. An attitude of humility, stemming from a purity of character, with a hunger to act, because we see the value of each and every person. And we see how the world doesn't recognize that value in each and every person. So help us to know that we can change the world. Not with our rhetoric, but by living our values, even at the price that we might pay for doing so. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.